Hi there. So today I'm going to do a more casual verbal log. Um, I've done a lot of code presentations. Those are a bit more formal, where I'm really trying to just convey concepts and get into technical things. This one's going to be casual, and hopefully I can do it all in one take. And yeah, so the big thing that I plan on getting into um, today is my recent journey into trying to get a new setup of operating systems on my PC. So I've always had a Windows OS, and over the past year and a half, I've tried to get a Linux OS set up on another hard drive, and it's actually led to unmanageable failure. Like, I could get it to work, but there'd be some issues. And recently, um, I had a little bit of some new impetus to um, get Linux set up on another hard drive on my computer, um, and so I went about trying to do that. The impetus was I've been doing open source work for Google's Chromium project, which is the open source project for their web browser known as Chrome. And in that open source work, I was doing my compilations on my Mac machine, and they were working. And all of the change work that I did, I submitted, and there are these machines that are called tribots that that try your work, given all the different compilations that Chrome is distributed with. And there was a couple Linux compilations that failed on those tribots. So I thought, why not, kind of branch out here, get Linux up and running, and be able to do my Chromium compilations for Linux. So um, the so that's what got me started into trying to get Linux set up on another hard drive. But I want to backtrack first and story tell here a little bit about why my first attempt at getting Linux set up failed. So um, Linux, or the PCs, as opposed to Macs, like if you have a PC machine, you're going to have this preliminary program, which isn't an operating system, uh, be what is booted into first, and that's called the BIOS. That stands for Basic Input Output System, and the setup that I wanted to do, starting over a year ago now, was to have was to be able to, well, actually, to go from the BIOS to a bootloader, and from the bootloader be able to boot into Linux on one machine and Windows on the other, or Linux on one hard drive and Windows on the other. Well, I don't remember uh, not being able to have this setup work, but I do remember not using this setup, so it didn't work for me. The setup that I ended up going for was to um, have the BIOS configuration boot or have the BIOS configuration boot into the Linux bootloader and to switch over to the Windows operating system, um, select the hard drive that the Windows operating system and bootloader was on as the hard drive to boot into when I wanted to switch over to Windows. So, it's not as streamlined as having one bootloader where um, you don't have to go into menus and stuff and do your reconfiguring. Um, but this setup didn't work. I would have been fine with manually changing between selecting what bootloader to go into, but what was happening was the BIOS was having a hard drive uh, boot entry multiplication issue. So, let's say there was originally three different hard drive boot entries to select. As I would switch between these different options here, I was seeing a multiplying of the same um, boot entry, and to the point where it get up to like 10 or so. And the hack that I was using was to um, do what's called a reflash of the BIOS program. So the motherboard has a special button you push while you have the flash software on a USB plugged into the motherboard, and that reflashing, research online said, is not something you want to be doing at all, or seldom. So mainly because if it fails for whatever reason, you're kind of um, uh, really in an unfortunate position where you can't even get into your BIOS, and you'd have to bring it into a repair store or something like that. So I was all gung ho about being able to use Linux a bunch, but I was cut short of doing it because I just wasn't comfortable with doing this reflashing because of this darn um, BIOS boot entry problem. So that was more than a year ago now, and I just stuck with Windows. That's my original system I'm used to for doing development work, and um, but since I was doing the Chromium work, I thought of trying to get back into the swing of things um, with having a Linux machine or a Linux operating system, and um, being a more capable developer that could do stuff in different systems, and would was um, really liking the idea of having that skill. So today is Wednesday night. Saturday night was when I started this whole voyage of trying to um, get a new operating system set up on my machine, and of course, as is the case with getting things set up, getting environments set up, whether it be hardware or software, you run into a lot of roadblocks. Um, it doesn't seem like you're progressing that much because it's not like regular development work where you get one thing done and you're successful, and you get the next thing done, and you really you know, um, chain together a lot of planned actions over, weeks at a time where there's never a hiccup. Well, you know, getting development environments set up, getting hardware set up is not like that. It takes a bit of time. Like if you get started at a company, and you get your new computer. It takes a while to get up and running. So it was the same thing with me, and it started out as a weekend project, just something to try to do. But I started getting into it, and my mindset was kind of like, well, darn, I wasn't able to get my first couple ideas going, but since this Linux setup stuff was fresh in my mind, I wanted to get something that was workable, because I really do want to start working in multiple operating systems. So, um, so Saturday night, the setup that I wanted to get was to have a Linux bootloader, um, be able to boot to three different operating systems, um, and one hard drive would have two Linux systems, and the other hard drive would be Windows, which wouldn't wouldn't need to be reinstalled. I would just use my current existing Windows operating system on one hard drive, and on my extra hard drive, which I currently wasn't using anything for, um, boot into Arch Linux, which is a hardcore Linux distribution, and be able to boot into Ubuntu, which is a soft, uh, easy to use, easy to install Linux distribution. But I wanted Ubuntu because Chrome, the most Chromium friendly, um, Linux operating system was Ubuntu. So, um, my my original setup that I researched that I would need to do, the documentation said if you want a dual boot, uh, where your Windows operating system is on another hard drive, you want to have both hard drives mirror each other in terms of the boot mode used. And that boot mode was the BIOS boot mode, not the more up to date and cutting edge UEFI boot mode. So, um, I had to use the BIOS one because Windows was set up with BIOS, and I didn't want to, reinstall Windows in UEFI boot mode, which I would have to do if I wanted to use it. So BIOS was the way to go. Um, both um, both the Linux operating systems and the Windows have to use the same boot mode to be able to bootload into both setups from the one bootloader. Um, the other thing was I wanted to use a GPT partitioning scheme um, on the Linux hard drive I had all set aside. And GPT is a partitioning scheme that you can use for hard drives larger than 2 terabytes. MBR is an older partitioning scheme you can only use for hard drives 2 terabytes and less. So um, I partitioned out this new hard drive, made two partitions, each 2 terabytes big, and did the GPT. Um, then installed Arch Linux, installed the flavor of Linux bootloader that I thought looked the best, and it was called Grub. There's a few different ones. I went with the Grub. So I got Grub set up. This whole Arch Linux and the partitioning and the bootloader is all set up. Then I configured the bootloader to be able to boot up the Windows operating system. So now in the bootloader there's two entries, one for Arch Linux, one for the Windows on the other hard drive. I crossed my fingers and went to boot into Windows. It seemed like it was working, and lo and behold, it actually led to a frozen Windows desktop. So no joy, no luck, and I had to keep moving forward. So the documentation for Arch Linux that got into the nuances of how to dual boot, it said, and it was a little bit unclear too. It said that you also wanted the partitioning schemes between the two hard drives to be the same, which didn't make much sense to me. I mean, I have no idea why you need to have it be the same. They seem like two totally separate layers. One's the boot mode, the other is the partitioning scheme, the scheme used to divide up the hard drive. Why that would have consequences, I don't know, but the documentation was saying to be able to boot into dual boot into Windows and other hard drive, you want to mirror not only the boot setup mode, which was BIOS, you also want to mirror the partitioning scheme. So I started from scratch, rewrote over my hard drive in MBR. The one sad aspect was it was an MBR partitioning scheme, so I couldn't use 2 of the 4 terabytes since the MBR can't map beyond 2 terabytes large of a size. So did the whole setup, did the install, partitioning, installation of the bootloader, configuring of Windows to be booted into from the bootloader, saw the 2 different entries in the bootloader, tried to boot into Windows, and same frozen screen. So the thing that I did was, because I'm really strong-headed. I want to get what I am aiming for. So over the course of the last few days, I tried a different setup, which was to have a new Windows operating system as a third partition on this hard drive over here, and keep this second older Windows operating system up and running. And if I could get this all to work on this one hard drive, maybe just get rid of this old one and use this hard drive, which is an SSD, as my base of operations compiling off of, since it'd be a faster hard drive. One would hope and speculate, but um, this setup also led to the freezing. I did it. I went and did my repartitioning. Did partitions 1 and 2 on the hard drive, and the third one was all left open for the Windows install CD to install on, and it was actually free space left over for it. And went through the whole process, and that freezing still happened. There's a couple things I want to get into, which are just good to talk about. This is a log, so I'll say it. In the partitioning of these guys here, the lowest unit size that you can partition is sectors. Sectors are 512 bytes in size, so you're going to have a lot of sectors for one hard drive. In the partitioning, let's say we're partitioning this guy here, the start sector, let's say it's 8192. The end sector could be like 500,499, and for this guy, you want to have it butt up right up against the the last sector of the first partition, so you'd have it start out at 500,500, right? That's one thing to keep in mind with how these ranges work is they are closed range. The values tell you what the first sector is and what the last sector is. It's a bit different than how we've been trained to think in terms of addition and subtraction, like in elementary school. Like 8 plus 4 is 12, right? Well, the 8 isn't included in that adding of 4 units. It's 4 units on top of the 8. Well, in this case, the first number is included in the range here, and this last number is included. So, that's something to keep in mind and be aware of. Of course, when doing software, is your ability to visualize units correctly. So there's that little aside. Another thing that I want to note was it was this new setup that I tried was over the last couple of days while I was doing my open source work. And some people say you don't want to do context switching that much when you're working. There's like a camp of people in business and and at the workplace that are not fans of context switching. They do not want to have to do it. They want to be able to focus on their one task. And there's another camp of people that say you do, as you progress with your skills and your ability to work, you want to be able to start context switching. Um, you want to be able to jump over to a new task or an existing task while a different task is, say, taking its course. Perhaps it's at a point where you need to wait on it. So, basically, what I'm trying to say is this was something that I was able to do along with other work. So I want, that's something I want to work towards, is being able to, really be able to take on multiple tasks and do that context switching, um, you know, more and more quickly. So, um, give me one moment. I'm just gonna take a drink of water. Okay. Um, so I went for that. Yeah, I went for that setup. The Windows still froze, so I decided to. Um, I just decided to see if I could get the Arch Linux and Ubuntu to be booted into from the bootloader, and uh, lo and behold, that actually failed as well. I tried a few different ways where I tried the Arch Linux's documentation for doing the grub bootloader, and for the life of me, I couldn't get the configuration to find the Ubuntu's Linux processes and init or initializer processes correctly. I then tried out one Q&A answer online for my issue that I googled, was saying just let Ubuntu's installer um, take over for setting up the bootloader. I did that, and Arch Linux did come up as one of the entries, and the Windows on the opposite hard drive came up as another boot entry. So immediately I was like, oh, okay, I want to try doing try that with the Windows boot to see if it would just magically work. Still led to the freezing. Um, so then I tried booting into the Ubuntu auto configured Arch Linux boot entry from the Ubuntu auto configured bootloader, and it led to a pretty severe error. There were notations of hexadecimal, areas that were being reported, and so no, still again, no joy for me being able to to boot into two different systems. One, I want to be able to do it. I'm a big fan. I'm sold on Arch Linux, and I also want to do Ubuntu because it's Chromium friendly. Um, but in the end of the day, a setup that I just got around to um, and tested out to the point where I think it actually works is just having Ubuntu uh, with GPT set up. Because, as much as I like Arch Linux, I'm going to go with the Chromium friendly Ubuntu to be able to do Chromium compilations in Linux. And that boot multiplication issue of that was seen, that I described, that was happening with my setup a year ago, it isn't happening this time. So I have a manageable system. I do need to manually go into the BIOS to select the Ubuntu bootloader to get into Ubuntu and the Windows bootloader to get into Windows, but I'm not seeing um, that boot multiplication uh, bug happening. So it's good. It took me some time to, of course, get to this setup that looks like it's going to work. Fingers crossed. Um, and some concluding notes. UEFI is the way of the future for the boot setup to use for computers. It's the new standard. Um, what's not that nice is currently boot setups in UEFI um, are boot setups in UEFI for Linux aren't they're not they're they're hard to set up. I looked at the Arch Linux documentation on doing that, and like they have it, but they don't have signed SSL signed packages for doing the UEFI way. So there's still work to be done and ground to be gained, and before being able to do UEFI based boot setups in Linux is open and more readily available to moderate Linux users like myself. So, other concluding statements. Um, this is something I want to do. I want to, as a matter of being a better developer, I want to work in different operating systems, compile for different operating systems. Um, I don't want to. I don't want to be blind, if you will, or insensitive to um, partitions and hard drives and mounting and BIOS stuff. That's an area that I think will reap benefit if I get some skilling. Um, and it's good because it's even yeah, I have to reinforce to myself that even though I'm not seeing progress like in a development where you have a streamlined process that you know will you're not going to reach roadblocks and you're going to be able to make progress in your work day by day. With this, there were a lot of roadblocks. It seemed like uh, waste of time or what have you. But like anything, especially when it comes to software, um, it takes time. So uh, it's no different with trying to get machine setups going, such as this one, which fingers crossed will work out. Um, I got the Ubuntu set up. I'll be able to compile for it, and I got my original Windows machine, which actually I don't use for the Chromium compilations. Um, I use it for this. I use it for the screencasting. So yeah, that is it. I will keep on doing this logging. I think it's good. It's good to be able to talk. Doing this development stuff. It's easy to get you know zoned in on work day in and day out, and you find you're not talking that much. So that's why I'm happy to be able to log, verbally log this stuff. So yeah, it's all good stuff. All right, bye.